1943, November 20, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll, Gilbert Islands, 0545. This is what I remember about the morning I was supposed to die. The sunrise was beautiful. Orange light spilled across the Pacific like something God had painted to mock us. I sat in the belly of an LCVP with 31 other Marines, the radio strapped to my back like a tumor, and I watched the naval barrage light up the island ahead in flashes of white and amber. The shells had been falling for hours. From out here, it looked like nothing on that island could still be alive. That was the promise they sold us on the transport ship. 3 hours of shelling, then a walk-in, a morning's work. A few of the younger guys believed it. I wanted to. This is a story about Tarawa. November 1943. 76 hours on a coral island smaller than some county fairgrounds. I was a radio man. The one carrying the voice of every man who needed something he wasn't going to get. You'll walk with me from the moment the ramps dropped, to the moment the island went quiet, through reef water and bunker smoke and nights that tried to swallow us whole. But the thing that broke me wasn't a bullet or a blast. It was a choice I made on the second night, and I'll get to that because I have to. The engines changed pitch. I felt it in my spine before I heard it, a grinding, shuddering whine that turned every head in the boat. Corporal Gage, wedged beside me, grabbed my arm. His fingers were shaking, but his face was flat, like he'd already decided to skip the fear and go straight to whatever came after. The coxswain cursed, loud. The kind of cursing you don't hear from Navy men unless the plan just died. We'd hit the reef. 500 yards out, maybe more. The island was a low, dark smear behind the smoke of our own bombardment, and we were stuck on coral like a boot jammed in a gopher hole. The engine screamed. The hull lurched. Nothing. Around us, boat after boat shuddered to a stop, some canting sideways as the reef grabbed their keels. I could see men standing up in other craft, looking over gunwales, trying to understand why the world had stopped moving. Then the ramp dropped. The coxswain didn't wait for an order. He just pulled the lever and that steel jaw fell open, and what I saw beyond it wasn't a beach. It was an ocean. Chest-deep water, green and shot through with morning light, stretching out to a seawall I could barely see. And between us and that wall, nothing. No cover, no defilade, no plan that survived contact with that reef. "Go," someone shouted. Maybe it was Sergeant Harkin. Maybe it was God clearing the chamber. Either way, we went. I dropped into water that hit my diaphragm like a fist. The cold wasn't cold. It was a kind of violent baptism, salt and coral grit flooding up under my dungarees and into every open cut from the cargo nets. The radio pack doubled my weight. I held my carbine above my head with both hands and started walking, and the man in front of me did the same, and the man in front of him, and for a few seconds it was almost peaceful, a procession of helmets and raised rifles moving through turquoise water while the island smoked ahead. Then the Japanese opened up. I don't know how to describe what machine gun fire sounds like when it hits water around you. It's not like the movies. It's not a zip or a whine. It's a sound like tearing, like the surface of the ocean is fabric and someone is ripping it apart in long, ragged strips. Plumes kicked up everywhere. I saw a man 2 rows ahead jerk sideways and go under without a sound. His helmet floated. His rifle didn't. I kept walking. That's the part no one tells you about. That in the worst moment of your life, your legs just keep going because they don't know what else to do. The water dragged at every step. Coral sliced my shins through my boots. The radio on my back made me taller than every man around me, a perfect antenna of flesh, and I knew with absolute clarity that the enemy could see me, that I was the one they'd pick. "Stay low," Gage screamed from somewhere behind me, which was insane advice for a man standing in 4 feet of water with no way to get lower without drowning. I leaned forward, hunched, as if bad posture could stop a bullet. The seawall was still hundreds of yards out. The distance didn't shrink. It just sat there, flat and pale and impossible, while the water around us turned pink in patches I refused to look at. To my left, an Amtrak, one of the few that had cleared the reef, took a direct hit from something heavy. The explosion sent a pillar of water and metal skyward, and pieces of it rained down around us, hissing as they hit the surface. Someone was screaming inside the wreck. I turned toward the sound without thinking, and Harkin's hand clamped my shoulder from behind. "Forward, Mick. You stop. You die." He was right. I hated him for it, but he was right. The timetable was dead. The orderly waves, the synchronized push, the clean arrows drawn on some officer's map aboard the Maryland, all of it dissolved the second the reef grabbed our boats. Now it was just men in water, walking toward guns, hoping that the ones in front absorbed enough fire to let the ones behind get a few yards closer. I don't know how long the wade took. Time doesn't work the way it's supposed to, when every second could be the one that ends you. I remember the water getting shallower. I remember my boots finding sand, and then coral shelf, and then a sickening crunch that I realized was someone's hand. I remember reaching the seawall, a low concrete lip barely 3 feet high, and throwing myself against it with the kind of gratitude you only feel for objects that stop bullets. I pressed my face into the rough surface and breathed. Around me, others piled in, gasping, bleeding, some crying, some silent in a way that was worse than crying. Gage made it. Harkin made it. Private Denny, 19 years old and built like a fence post, crawled up with both eyes wide and one sleeve soaked red from someone else's wound. I looked back toward the water. The reef line was littered with stalled boats. Between them and us, the waiting corridor was a graveyard in motion. Men still pushing forward, men floating face down, men dragging others who'd stopped moving. The water that had been turquoise at dawn was something else now. I unstrapped the radio, checked the handset, and pressed transmit. Red Beach 2. This is Foxtrot 7. We are at the seawall. Estimate 40% casualties in the wade. Repeat 40%. Request immediate. A burst stitched the top of the wall. Concrete chips sprayed my face. I dropped the handset. When I picked it up again, the channel was full of other voices, all of them saying the same thing in different words. Everyone was pinned. Everyone was bleeding. Everyone was asking for something that wasn't coming. Harkin slid down next to me, his back against the wall, his helmet tilted so I could see his eyes. He didn't say anything at first. He just started counting the men around us, pointing at each one with a finger that had gone steady now that the walking was over. He got to 11 and stopped. We'd started with 32. The seawall wasn't safety. It was a leash. 3 feet of poured concrete and coral rubble, that's what separated us from the Japanese positions dug into the sand 15 yards inland. We couldn't go forward because every bunker slid on the island had a line of fire that started at the top of that wall. We couldn't go back because going back meant the water, and the water was a killing floor that hadn't stopped taking payments since dawn. So we sat. 11 men pressed shoulder to shoulder in a stretch of wall maybe 20 yards long, bleeding into the sand, listening to the island try to finish what the reef had started. I got the radio working again within minutes. The set had taken splash, but the seals held. One small miracle in a morning that had burned through all the others. I cycled through frequencies and found a chaos of voices that painted a picture worse than anything I could see. Red Beach 1 was shattered. Red Beach 3 was pinned at the waterline. The second and third waves were stacking up on the reef, and the Amtraks, the ones that were supposed to carry men over the coral, were burning or sunk or circling in confusion because the shore was too hot to approach. Harkin crouched beside me, listening. He didn't ask for the handset. He just absorbed the transmissions the way a man reads weather, not for detail, but for direction. The pier, he said. I looked left. The long coconut log pier jutted out from the island's north shore, stretching over the reef and into deeper water. It was the only structure that bridged the gap between the stalled boats and the beach, and every man in the water had figured that out at the same time. I could see them, dozens, then scores, drifting toward it, using the pilings as cover, pressing themselves against the logs like the wood could save them from the rounds punching through it. They're funneling, I said. The Japanese see it too. He was right. The fire concentrated on the pier like a lens focusing sunlight. Rounds chewed the log pilings into splinters. Men who reached one piling would lunge for the next, and the gap between 3 feet, maybe 4, became a slot machine. Some made it. Some dropped into the water and didn't come back up. The pier wasn't a bridge, it was a sieve, and the enemy was patient enough to let it fill before they squeezed. I keyed the handset. All units waiting, stay off the pier. Repeat, stay off the pier. Disperse lateral, use wreckage for cover. The pier is a kill zone. Nobody answered. The channel was a wall of voices, requests for corpsmen, requests for ammo, requests for fire support, that the ships couldn't provide because we were too close to the enemy positions and nobody had coordinates that meant anything anymore. I was shouting into a storm. Gage, pressed flat against the wall to my right, pointed toward the water without lifting his head. There, a cluster of Marines had found a wrecked Amtrak about 200 yards out, the one I'd seen hit earlier. Its hull sat canted on the reef, half submerged, smoke still leaking from its engine bay. Men were gathering behind it, using the dead machine as a shield, and from that position they'd started a new wade, not toward the pier but angling south, where a gap in the seawall led to a narrow strip of beach that wasn't directly under the bunker embrasures. It was working. Slowly, brutally, but working. Men moved in clusters of 3 and 4, ducking behind floating packs, behind bodies, behind anything that broke the flat plane of the water. The Japanese gunners couldn't cover everything at once. Their fire swept in arcs, methodical, and in the gaps between sweeps, men surged forward 10 or 15 yards before dropping again. I watched a kid, couldn't have been older than Denny, wade with a radio pack just like mine, holding the antenna above the water with one hand, while his other arm cradled a wounded man across his chest. He moved like he was walking through wet concrete. Every step took a year. The wounded man's head lolled back, mouth open, and I couldn't tell if he was alive, or if the kid just didn't know how to let go. They made it to the wall 60 yards south of us. The kid dropped behind the concrete, lowered the wounded man gently, checked his neck for a pulse, and then sat very still for a long time. When he finally looked up, his face was blank in a way I recognized. The wounded man was dead. The kid had carried a corpse 200 yards through machine gun fire because putting him down would have meant admitting what he already knew. Foxtrot 7. This is Battalion. What is your position and strength? Over. The voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that comes from being on a ship where the floors don't bleed. Battalion. Foxtrot 7. Seawall. Red Beach 2. Approximately grid reference, I guessed. I had no map that matched what this island actually looked like. Strength is 11 effectives. The reef has stalled all landing craft. Troops are waiting under sustained automatic weapons fire. The pier is a concentrated kill zone, requesting you divert subsequent waves to southern approach using wrecked armor as waypoints. Over. A pause. Static. Then, Foxtrot 7. Hold position. Reinforcements en route. I wanted to laugh. Reinforcements en route meant more men in the water. More men walking through the same corridor of fire that had already cut us in half. The only thing en route was more dying, delivered in neat boatloads of 32. Harkin took the handset from me. Not roughly, the way you take a tool from someone who's been holding it too long. Battalion, this is Sergeant Harkin, acting platoon lead. Your reinforcements will die on the reef unless you route them south of the pier and provide suppressive naval fire on the bunker line at grid. He rattled off numbers he'd been calculating in his head since we hit the wall. Distances, angles, the geometry of murder worked out by a man who'd done math problems in boot camp that were supposed to be hypothetical. The channel went silent for 10 seconds. Then a different voice, older, clipped, someone with oak leaves or eagles on his collar. Understood. Adjusting. Keep this channel open. Harkin handed the radio back. You're the most important man on this beach, Mick. Not because of what you carry, because you're the only mouth that talks to the ships. I didn't want to be the most important man on that beach. The most important man is the one everyone needs, and the one everyone needs is the one the enemy needs, dead. I was a voice in a box strapped to a target, crouched behind a wall that was already pocked with impact craters, on an island where the plan had died before breakfast. But the radio worked, and the men in the water needed someone to tell the ships where to shoot and where to send the next wave, and which stretch of reef was a graveyard and which was merely a death trap. So I pressed the handset to my ear, and I listened, and I talked, and I tried to turn noise into information while the island shook around me. By mid-morning, the tide began to shift. Not enough to float the stalled boats, but enough to change the depth in the waiting corridor from chest-high to waist-high in places. Men moved faster. Casualties still fell, but the ratio tilted, just barely, just enough that the trickle reaching the seawall became something almost like a flow. Bodies accumulated at the wall. Living ones, bleeding ones, men from shattered platoons who'd lost their officers in the wade and attached themselves to whatever cluster of Marines had a sergeant still breathing. Our 11 became 19, then 26. A lieutenant from Fox Company crawled in from the south with 6 men and a jaw wound that made his words sound like he was chewing gravel. "Who's got comms?" he slurred. Everyone pointed at me. He looked at the radio, then at the island behind the wall, the bunkers, the palm stumps, the low dark shapes of Japanese fighting positions, dug so deep they'd survived a naval bombardment that was supposed to erase them. "Get me the ships," he said. "We're going to need a lot more than what we brought." I looked back at the water one more time. The waiting corridor stretched out behind us like a scar on the ocean. Debris, smoke, the dark shapes of men still moving, the darker shapes of men who never would again. The pier stood in the middle of it all, chewed and splintered, and at its base the bodies had collected in a drift that moved gently with the current, as if the sea was trying to arrange them into something that made sense. It couldn't. Nothing about this made sense. We had a foothold now, not a beachhead, but a fracture, a crack in the island's shell just wide enough to bleed into. The lieutenant pressed his back against the wall and closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were harder. "Which way are the bunkers thickest?" Harkin pointed inland. 15 yards, concrete and coconut logs and steel plate, and men inside who'd been waiting for us longer than we'd been alive. The lieutenant nodded once, like a man confirming directions to his own funeral. The first man who tried to go over the wall was a private named Tolliver. I didn't know his first name then. I learned it later, from a chaplain who was writing letters to families and needed help spelling Massachusetts. Tolliver didn't announce it. He just stood up fast, athletic, the way you'd vault a fence back home, and threw one leg over the concrete lip. He made it to the top. For a half second he was silhouetted against the smoke and the shattered palms, and he looked almost heroic, almost like the posters they pinned up in recruiting offices back in San Diego. Then 2 rounds hit him from different angles at the same time, and he folded over the wall like a shirt draped on a line. Nobody moved. Nobody pulled him back. He hung there, half on our side and half on theirs, and the blood that ran down the concrete toward us was the only part of him that completed the crossing. That was hour 10. The lieutenant, his name was Haskell, Fox Company, and the jaw wound made him look like he was perpetually snarling, pulled Harkin and 2 other NCOs into a crouch conference against the wall. I stayed close because the radio stayed close, and wherever the radio went, the decisions followed. "We can't stay here," Haskell said through clenched teeth. Every word cost him. "The wall's a coffin lid. They've got interlocking fire from at least 3 positions, that big bunker at 2 o'clock, the emplacement behind the palm line at 10, and something buried at 12 that I can't even see. Every time a man shows his head, he catches crossfire." Harkin didn't argue. He drew a diagram in the sand with his finger. The wall, the bunker positions, the angles. It looked like a geometry problem from a textbook written by the devil. 3 firing slits, 3 converging lines, and every line crossed the same space, the 15 yards of open ground between our wall and their first position. "We need engineers," Harkin said. "Satchels, bangalores, flamethrowers, anything that reaches inside those slits without us standing up." "Engineers are in the water," I said. I'd heard it on the radio. The combat engineer teams had been in later waves, and those waves were still fighting the reef. Some of their Amtraks had made it, most hadn't. The men with the demolitions expertise, the ones who could crack a bunker open like a shell, were scattered across a half-mile of ocean, waiting or floating or neither. Haskell stared at the wall for a long time. The firing hadn't stopped. It came in bursts, disciplined, Japanese gunners conserving ammunition while we burned through ours, just trying to keep heads down. They didn't need to advance. They didn't need to do anything. They just had to wait behind their concrete and coconut logs and steel-reinforced firing slits while we baked in the sun and bled against their wall. "Corpsman," someone called from down the line. The word traveled like a current. Quiet, urgent, the most important word on any battlefield, and the most useless when there's no one to answer it. We had one corpsman. His name was Pelletier, a thin kid from Maine who'd lied about his eyesight to enlist and now crawled through sand and blood with a medical kit that was already half empty. I watched him move. He didn't walk or run. He flowed along the base of the wall like water finding a channel, keeping his body pressed so flat against the concrete that his belt buckle scraped a groove in the surface. He reached the wounded man, a Marine whose leg had been opened from knee to ankle by a fragment, and went to work without speaking. His hands moved with a precision that seemed impossible in this place. Tourniquet, sulfa powder, compress, tie, check pulse, move on. He wasn't healing anyone. I understood that by the second hour. He was sorting. His eyes would land on a wounded man, and in one blink he'd calculate. Can move, can't move, already gone. The ones who could be stabilized got his hands. The ones who couldn't got his voice, a few words, a touch on the forehead, the kind of lie that sounds like comfort. The ones already gone got nothing, because the living couldn't afford the time. Pelletier reached me on his crawl back and pressed himself against the wall. His hands were red to the wrist. He looked at me with the exhausted clarity of a man who'd passed through panic and come out the other side into something colder. "I need plasma," he said, "and I need a way to evacuate at least 4 men who won't last 2 more hours." "Evacuate where?" I asked. Behind us was the water. The water was the killing floor. To evacuate a wounded man meant carrying him back through the same corridor of fire we'd barely survived walking through, loading him onto a boat that was stuck on a reef, and hoping a Navy corpsman on a transport ship could do what Pelletier couldn't do with sand in his kit and bullets overhead. He didn't answer. He already knew. He just needed to say it out loud so the impossibility would belong to both of us instead of just him. I raised battalion on the radio. Foxtrot 7 requesting medical resupply and casualty evacuation at Red Beach, 2 seawall position. 4 urgent surgical, multiple ambulatory. Current corpsman is rationing supplies. Over. The ship's voice came back measured and steady, and I wanted to reach through the handset and drag whoever was speaking into this sand and make them listen to the sounds behind me. The groaning, the shallow rapid breathing, the wet rasp of a sucking chest wound that Pelletier had packed with a cellophane wrapper from a cigarette carton because he'd run out of proper seals. Foxtrot 7. Evacuation not possible at this time. Medical resupply will be included in next wave. Hold position. Hold position. The 2 most obscene words in the English language when you're holding a position that consists of men dying against a wall while the enemy watches from bunkers that our battleships couldn't scratch. The sun climbed. I'd stopped thinking of time as hours. It was measured in water now. How much was left in the canteens? How high the tide pushed against the reef behind us? How deep the sweat soaked into fabric that was already heavy with salt and someone else's blood? The temperature on Betio had nothing to do with Novembers I'd known. This was equatorial heat, the kind that doesn't build. It arrives whole, sits on you like a hand, and doesn't lift. By noon we had 33 men at our stretch of wall. Some were from our original wave. Most were strays. Marines who'd waded in from wrecked boats and drifted to whatever section of the wall had a cluster of living bodies. They came with stories told in fragments. A lieutenant shot through the throat 10 yards from the beach. A flamethrower operator whose tank was hit, turning him into a torch that ran screaming into the surf. A boat that took a mortar round on the reef and simply ceased to exist, leaving a circle of debris and silence where 30 men had been breathing. I wrote none of it down. There was no paper, and even if there had been, my hands were occupied. The radio was a living thing now, channels overlapping, calls stacking, every unit on the island trying to talk at once because talking to the ships was the only power anyone had left. I became a switchboard, a translator, a man who turned screaming into grid coordinates and grid coordinates into shells that fell, sometimes on the enemy, sometimes on us, sometimes on nothing at all because the island was so small and the line so close that precision was a prayer, not a science. Haskell organized what he had. He split the 33 into fire teams, assigned sectors, designated fields of fire that existed more in theory than in practice because our position was a linear strip of concrete with no depth and no flanks. He sent 2 men crawling south to link up with whatever unit held the next stretch of wall. They came back 20 minutes later. The next stretch of wall was held by dead men. "We're it," Haskell said. Not dramatically. The way you'd say we're out of milk. At some point in the early afternoon, the first engineers arrived. 3 of them. They'd waded in with a later wave, carrying their satchel charges in waterproof bags held above their heads like offerings. One of them, a staff sergeant whose name tape read Kerrigan, dropped behind the wall next to Haskell and immediately started studying the bunker positions with the detached focus of a man examining a plumbing problem. "That one," he said, pointing to the largest emplacement. Coconut log and sand construction over reinforced concrete. 3-foot walls minimum. The firing slit is about 8 inches high, maybe 30 inches wide. I can kill it, but I need to get within 10 feet. 10 feet. 10 feet from a bunker that had been firing without pause for 6 hours. 10 feet across open ground that was pre-sighted by at least 2 other positions. "What do you need from us?" Harkin asked. "Smoke. Suppressive fire on the flanking positions, and someone who can throw a charge through an 8-inch slit if I don't make it." The plan was simple in the way that suicidal things are simple. Smoke grenades to blind the flanking bunkers. Every rifle we had pouring rounds into the embrasures to force the gunners back from their slits for a few seconds. And Kerrigan, running 10 feet with a satchel charge that weighed 15 pounds and had a fuse he'd have to light with hands that were already shaking. I relayed the fire support request to the ships. Foxtrot 7 requesting naval gunfire on coordinates. Harkin fed me numbers. 5-inch airburst if possible. Time on target when you hear our smoke grenades pop. Give us 30 seconds of hell on the northeast bunker line. The ship acknowledged. 30 seconds. That was the window. 30 seconds of naval shells and rifle fire and smoke, and in that window, one man with a bag of explosives had to cross 15 yards of open ground and place a charge close enough to a bunker slit to blow the throat out of the beast. Kerrigan checked his satchel, checked his fuse, checked his lighter, a Zippo with a dent in the case that he rubbed once with his thumb like a ritual. Haskell gave the signal. Smoke grenades arced over the wall. White phosphorus clouds bloomed in the afternoon heat, and for a moment the world turned to milk, pale, thick, directionless. Every rifle opened up. The noise was physical. I pressed into the wall and covered the radio with my body because if the radio died, every man on this beach lost his voice. And Kerrigan went over. I didn't see what happened next. I heard it. Boots on sand. A burst of fire, Japanese, close, frantic. A second burst. Then a sound that was either a body hitting the ground or a satchel charge landing against concrete. Then Kerrigan's voice, clear and sharp and impossibly calm. Fire in the hole. The explosion rocked the wall. Sand and debris rained down. My ears went flat. A high whine replacing the world. And when sound came back, it was different. The rhythmic hammering from the main bunker had stopped. In its place, smoke pouring from the slit, and a silence that felt like the island had lost a tooth. Kerrigan crawled back over the wall. His left arm was bleeding from the bicep, a graze or a fragment, impossible to tell, and his face was the color of wet ash. He sat down against the concrete, looked at Haskell, and said one word, "Next." But the bunker was dead. One bunker out of dozens. One slit closed in a wall of slits that stretched across the island like eyes that never blinked. We'd traded smoke and shells and Kerrigan's blood for a single corridor of silence. A narrow lane where the crossfire no longer crossed. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was a crack. A space just wide enough for men to move through if they stayed low and didn't breathe too loud and accepted that the positions on either side of the dead bunker were still alive, still watching, still waiting for anyone stupid enough to mistake one small victory for safety. Haskell looked through the gap. Then he looked at Harkin. Then he looked at me. "Tell battalion, we have a lane. One lane. Narrow, fire from both flanks still active." He paused. "Tell them the plan is now meter by meter." I keyed the handset and said the words, and on the other end of the frequency, someone on a clean ship with a dry floor wrote it down in a logbook that would survive this day even if we didn't. Meter by meter. That was the new war. Not the sweeping arrows on the briefing maps. Not the 3-hour timeline. Not the clean amphibious doctrine they'd rehearsed in New Zealand. Just men with explosives crawling toward concrete boxes, buying ground in increments measured by the length of a body. The sun was past its peak now. Shadows stretched east from the palm stumps, and the heat had baked the blood on the wall into dark stains that looked like maps of countries that didn't exist. Pelletier was still crawling his circuit, but his movements had slowed. His kit was empty. He was using strips torn from dead men's shirts as bandages, and the look in his eyes had shifted from exhaustion to something else, a focused mechanical detachment that I recognized because I could feel it forming in myself. You don't stay afraid for 10 hours straight. The body can't sustain it. What happens instead is a narrowing. The world shrinks to the next task, the next breath, the next transmission, and everything outside that tunnel goes dark. It's not courage. It's not numbness. It's the mind building a smaller room, so it doesn't have to see the whole house burning. Kerrigan was already studying the next bunker. His arm was wrapped in a strip of dungaree fabric, the blood seeping through in a Rorschach pattern he didn't bother to check. The Zippo was back in his hand, thumb on the dent. I looked at the gap we'd bought, that one narrow lane through the crossfire, and I thought about the math. Dozens of bunkers, 3 engineers, 2 satchel charges left. This island was going to eat us alive, and it was only going to do it one bunker at a time. The crack Kerrigan had blown became our throat, and like all throats, it could swallow you or choke you depending on which way the air moved. Haskell sent the first fire team through at hour 18, just as the sun started its slide toward the western horizon and the light shifted from white to amber. 4 men, low crawling through the lane where the dead bunker's silence created a narrow corridor free of crossfire. They made it 6 yards before the flanking positions adjusted and rounds started chewing the sand around them. They pressed flat, belly down, faces in coral grit, breathing through their teeth while bullets cracked overhead at heights measured in inches. I watched from the wall, the radio pressed to my ear, relaying positions to the ships. Foxtrot 7 requesting suppressive fire on grid. And Harkin's finger would stab the sand diagram, and I'd translate his geometry into numbers that a gunnery officer 2 miles offshore could feed into a 5-inch gun that would, if the math held, if the wind cooperated, if God was paying attention, drop a shell close enough to the flanking bunker to make the gunners flinch. The shell came. It hit 30 yards east of the target, blowing a crater in empty sand and showering the fire team with debris, but doing nothing to the bunker. The gunners didn't flinch. They'd survived a pre-invasion bombardment that was supposed to erase the island. A single off-target round was weather to them. Adjust fire. Left 3-0, drop 1-5, Harkin said. I repeated it. The next round was closer. The third hit the bunker's outer wall, a direct strike that should have killed everything inside. Sand and log fragments erupted upward. For 3 seconds, the flanking fire stopped. Go, Haskell shouted. The fire team surged forward. 6 yards became 10, became 15, and suddenly they were past the dead bunker's shadow and into the space beyond, a shallow depression between 2 palm stumps where the sand had been scooped out by earlier shelling. They dropped in, alive, inland, the first Americans past the seawall in our sector. It didn't look like a victory. It looked like 4 men lying in a hole, but it was a foothold behind the wall. And footholds mattered now because the entire battle had contracted to this scale. Not beaches, not sectors, not operational objectives, but holes, craters, depressions. Any scoop in the earth deep enough to shelter a body from the horizontal fire that webbed across the island like wire. Haskell sent a second team, then a third. Each crossing was its own separate war. The sprint through the lane, the suppressive fire, the prayer that the flanking gunners were reloading or repositioning or dying. Some teams made it clean, one didn't. A Marine named Crowell took a round through the hip halfway across and went down in the open, screaming in a register that didn't sound human. Pelletier was over the wall before anyone could stop him, dragging Crowell back by his webbing, and the rounds that chased them kicked sand so close to Pelletier's legs that his dungarees were shredded below the knee when he fell back behind the concrete. Crowell lived. His war was over, but he lived. And Pelletier tied off the wound with a strip of parachute silk that someone had been carrying as a souvenir and never would again. By the time we had 15 men on the inland side of the wall, the sun was low and the shadows of the shattered palms stretched across the sand like fingers reaching for us. Haskell moved the command element through himself. Harkin, me and the radio, Kerrigan with his one remaining satchel charge. We crossed the lane in a crouch run that lasted maybe 4 seconds but felt like I was sprinting through a photograph. Every detail frozen and vivid, the texture of the sand, the smell of cordite and cooked coconut, and something sweet and rotten that I refused to name, the sound of my own breathing louder than the gunfire. We made it to the depression. I set up the radio in the hole and looked around at our new position. We were maybe 20 yards past the seawall now, inland, surrounded by a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon, if the moon had been made of coral and then beaten with hammers for 3 hours. Craters everywhere, shattered tree trunks, chunks of concrete and twisted rebar jutting from the sand like broken bones. And ahead, always ahead, the low dark shapes of more bunkers, more firing slits, more positions dug so deep into the island's skin that they seemed to grow from it like tumors. Kerrigan was already studying the next target. The large strong point, the one the briefing maps had marked as a command bunker, though nobody trusted the briefing maps anymore. It sat 40 yards ahead, a mound of sand and coconut logs reinforced with steel rail and concrete, and its firing slit watched our position with the patient malice of an eye that never needed to blink. That's the spine, Kerrigan said. Kill that, and the positions on either side lose coordination. They'll still fire, but they won't fire together. Harkin studied it. How do you want to approach? I don't. Kerrigan's voice was flat. I want to put a charge in its mouth from here, but I can't throw 15 pounds 40 yards, so someone has to carry it. You've already gone once, and I'll go again. But I need more than smoke this time. I need bodies. I need men making noise and drawing fire from multiple angles so the slit can't focus. It was a plan that required men to volunteer to be targets, not decoys. Targets. Men who would advance toward the bunker from different directions, firing and moving, knowing that the bunker would engage them, hoping that the gunner inside would choose to shoot at someone else in the half-second it took Kerrigan to reach the wall and place his charge. Haskell didn't ask for volunteers. He pointed. Gage, take 2 men and approach from the left crater line. Harkin, take 3 and push from the right along the palm stumps. Everyone else provides base of fire from here. He looked at me. Get me the ships again. Same drill, 5-inch on the flanking positions when we go. I raised the ship. The gunnery officer on the other end of the frequency had changed. A new voice, younger, with a steadiness that suggested he was reading from a manual rather than feeling the ground shake. I gave him coordinates. He read them back. I confirmed. Somewhere offshore, men in clean uniforms loaded shells into guns, pointed at a dot on the ocean that they'd never walk on, and the abstraction of their war, numbers on a chart, deflections and elevations, was about to become very concrete for the men inside that bunker. Kerrigan lit a cigarette. Not from nerves, from ritual. He smoked half of it, crushed the other half into the sand, and picked up the satchel charge the way a carpenter picks up a toolbox. The Zippo went into his breast pocket. The fuse dangled from the charge like a tail. 30 seconds after the first shell, he said. That's my window. Haskell nodded. The teams moved out. Gage left, Harkin right, crawling through craters and debris, moving in the slow, careful way that men move when every inch of ground might be the one where a bullet finds them. I watched Harkin's team navigate the palm stumps, using the fallen trunks as cover, slithering over the rough bark with their weapons cradled across their forearms. The first naval shell hit. Close this time, the gunnery officer had calibrated off our earlier adjustments, and the round struck the sand 20 yards east of the command bunker, sending a geyser of coral and debris skyward. The second shell was closer. The third hit the bunker's outer wall, and the concussion wave rolled over us like a physical thing, pressing the air flat. The bunker's firing slit went momentarily dark. Dust, debris, the gunner ducking, or dead, or stunned. It didn't matter. It was the window. Kerrigan went. He didn't run the way Tolliver had. Upright and athletic and doomed. He moved in a crouch so low his knuckles nearly dragged the sand. The satchel charge clutched to his chest, and he covered the 40 yards in a line that wasn't straight. He zagged between craters, using every depression, every chunk of debris, every shadow as a momentary shield. Gage's team opened fire from the left. Harkin's from the right. The noise was a solid wall. Our rifles, the bunker's machine gun coming back to life, the crack of rounds crossing in the air between them. I couldn't watch and I couldn't look away. Kerrigan reached the bunker's outer wall, the sand and log face of the mound, and pressed himself flat against it. He was below the firing slit now. The gunner inside couldn't depress the weapon low enough to hit a man standing against his own wall. It was the one blind spot, and Kerrigan had found it. He lit the fuse. I saw the flare of the Zippo, that dented ritual Zippo, and then he jammed the satchel charge upward into the slit, pushing it through the 8-inch gap with both hands like a man stuffing a letter into a mailbox. Fire in the hole! He was already running when the charge detonated. The bunker didn't explode outward, it imploded. The blast went inward, channeled by the concrete walls, and what came out of the slit was a tongue of flame and pressure that blew sand and smoke 50 feet into the air. The mound sagged, the firing stopped, and then something happened that the plan hadn't accounted for. A Japanese soldier came out, through a rear entrance I hadn't known existed, a low crawl hole behind the mound, invisible from our position. He came out on his hands and knees, covered in dust and blood, and he had a rifle, and he was pointing it at Kerrigan's back. Gage shot him, 1 round, from 30 yards, while moving. The soldier dropped into the sand and didn't move again, and Kerrigan never knew how close he'd come because he was already diving into the nearest crater, the Zippo still hot in his pocket. The command bunker was dead. The spine was broken. For 5 minutes, 5 actual minutes that felt like the first breath after drowning, the fire around our position decreased. Not stopped, decreased. The flanking bunkers were still active, but their firing had lost its rhythm. Without the command bunker coordinating them, they fired independently, still lethal, still constant, but no longer synchronized. The crossfire patterns that had made the seawall a death trap became individual lanes of fire with gaps between them. Exploitable gaps. Haskell pushed men into those gaps. Teams of 3 and 4, moving in rushes, occupying craters and depressions and the blasted remains of Japanese fighting positions that had been abandoned or destroyed. Our perimeter expanded, not in yards but in feet. 20 feet here, 30 there, each gain paid for in ammunition and sweat, and the particular kind of luck that isn't luck at all, but just the random distribution of bullets that didn't hit you. By late afternoon, we had something that almost resembled a pocket. A rough oval of occupied ground, maybe 50 yards deep and 30 wide, anchored on the seawall behind us and extending inland past the dead command bunker. It wasn't secure, it wasn't defensible, but it was ours, and for the first time since the ramps dropped, we had ground that we'd taken from them instead of ground they'd simply allowed us to bleed on. I reported it. Foxtrot 7 to Battalion. We have established a pocket inland of Red Beach, 2 seawall, approximately 50 by 30 yards. Command bunker neutralized. Flanking positions still active but uncoordinated. Requesting resupply of ammunition, water, and demolitions. Casualty count. I paused. Counted. 17 KIA confirmed. 22 WIA. 31 effectives. Over. The ship acknowledged. A resupply run was organized. Ammo and water loaded into a surviving Amtrak that would try to thread the reef at the next high tide. It would be ours. The ammunition we had was what we'd carried through the water, minus everything we'd spent breaking one bunker. Harkin did the math without being asked. 4 magazines per man average. 2 grenades total in the pocket. 1 satchel charge. No mortar rounds. Haskell absorbed this the way he absorbed everything, with a clench of his damaged jaw and a silence that lasted exactly long enough to be terrifying. "Dig in," he said. "Improve positions. Link up with adjacent units if they exist. We hold this pocket through the night." The night. I hadn't thought about the night. The day had been so relentlessly full of dying that the idea of darkness, real darkness, on an island where the enemy knew every inch of ground and we knew nothing, felt like a door opening into a room I didn't want to enter. We started digging. Helmets and hands and bayonets, scraping coral and sand into low walls around our positions. The digging was almost peaceful, the rhythmic scrape of metal on earth, the familiar motions of muscles doing something that wasn't killing or running. Men didn't talk while they dug. They just worked, and in the working there was a kind of sanity that the rest of the day had stripped away. I sat with the radio and watched the shadows lengthen. The sun touched the horizon behind us, over the ocean, and the light turned the water gold, and then copper, and then the color of old blood. The reef was still out there, still littered with stalled boats and the dark shapes of men who'd never made it past the waiting corridor. The tide was coming in, lifting the bodies gently, carrying some of them toward the beach in a slow processional that nobody had ordered and nobody could stop. Kerrigan sat 3 feet away, field stripping his lighter with the concentration of a jeweler. His arm wound had stopped bleeding, but the fabric bandage was stiff with dried blood and sand, and he moved the injured arm carefully, testing its range, calculating what it could still do. "How many more bunkers?" I asked. He didn't look up. "On this sector? Maybe 8, 10? Across the whole island?" A pause. I stopped counting. "And we've got 1 satchel charge left. 1 satchel. No flamethrowers. No Bangalores." He snapped the Zippo back together. "We'll improvise. Pack grenades into sandbags. Use captured Japanese explosives if we find any. There's always a way to blow a hole in something." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the math could work. 1 satchel charge, a handful of grenades, and the stubbornness of men who had nowhere to retreat to. But the island was still full of bunkers, still full of defenders who'd been preparing for this fight longer than we'd been planning it, and the safe pocket we'd carved out of their defenses was already shrinking in my mind as darkness approached. A mortar round hit the eastern edge of our pocket. Then another, then a third, walking toward the center in steady increments that meant someone on the other side was adjusting fire with professional patience. Men dove into their half-dug holes. Sand erupted. A piece of shrapnel sang past my ear close enough that I felt the heat of it on my skin. "Incoming! Adjust position south," Haskell shouted, and men scrambled, dragging wounded, clutching weapons, and the safe pocket that had existed for 5 minutes was suddenly a target, ranged and bracketed and falling under the same methodical fire that we'd been on the receiving end of all day. Safety had lasted minutes. The island was reminding us that it didn't give anything away, it only loaned it, at interest rates paid in blood. Night came to Betio, the way a hand closes over a candle, fast, total, and without mercy. There was no twilight. One moment the sky was streaked with copper and smoke. The next it was black, and the blackness was so complete that I couldn't see my own hands on the radio. The equatorial dark had a weight to it, a physical density that pressed against the eyes and turned every sound into a shape you couldn't verify. Palm fronds rustling became footsteps. The settling of sand in a crater became a man crawling. The tick of cooling metal from a destroyed Amtrak became a rifle bolt sliding home. I pressed my back against the wall of my foxhole, a scrape in the coral barely deep enough to cover my chest, and listened to the island breathe. The mortar fire had stopped an hour before sunset. Not tapered, stopped like someone had turned off a faucet. The silence that replaced it was worse than the shelling because shelling had a logic you could react to. Silence was a question with no answer. And on Betio, unanswered questions got men killed. Harkin moved through the pocket in a crouch, checking positions. I tracked his progress by sound alone, the soft scrape of his boots, the low murmur of his voice as he reached each foxhole. He spoke to every man, not speeches, single sentences. Stay low, challenge before you fire. If it moves and doesn't answer, kill it. The words weren't comforting. They were a framework, something to hold on to when the darkness dissolved every other certainty. He reached my hole and dropped in beside me. His body was warm and smelled like sweat and cordite, and the particular sour tang of a man who hadn't eaten in 18 hours. Radio check, he said. I keyed the handset. Foxtrot 7, comms check, over. Battalion came back. Clear, steady. Still on their ship, still dry, still writing things in logbooks. They told me what I already knew, that the beachhead was a thin ribbon, that the pocket we'd carved was one of only 3 inland positions on the entire island, and that the Japanese still held 80% of Betio. They told me that the night would be long. They told me to expect counter-infiltration. They didn't tell me what counter-infiltration would feel like. It started around 2200. Not with a charge, that was the Hollywood version. The one where a wave of screaming men rushes your position and you mow them down in a blaze of heroic fire. The real thing was quieter, slower, more intimate, a sound from the north edge of the pocket. Not a footstep, softer. The sound of cloth brushing sand. I heard it and Harkin heard it, and we both froze with the stillness of animals who've just caught a predator's scent. Challenge, Harkin breathed. Cactus, I whispered into the dark. The night's countersign. Anyone who answered with needle was ours. Anyone who didn't answer was theirs. Silence. Then, a shuffle. Closer. 5 yards, maybe less. The darkness was so thick I could have been staring directly at a man and not known it. My hand found my carbine. My thumb found the safety. The click of it disengaging sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. A grenade exploded at the southern edge of the pocket. The flash was blinding. A white-orange burst that imprinted shadows on my retinas and then vanished, leaving the darkness even blacker than before. Someone screamed. Not a wounded scream, a startled one, the kind of sound a man makes when the world tears open beside him without warning. Then gunfire. Ours. Frantic, undisciplined. Men firing at muzzle flashes and sounds and the shapes their fear painted on the darkness. Tracers streaked across the pocket in lines that revealed our positions to anyone watching, and someone was always watching on Betio. Cease fire. Cease fire. Haskell's voice, raw and commanding, cutting through the noise. Check your targets. You're shooting at each other. The firing stuttered and stopped. In the ringing silence that followed, I heard it again, that soft cloth on sand sound, but now from multiple directions. Not one infiltrator. Several. Moving through the gaps in our perimeter, the way water finds cracks in a dam. A burst of Japanese words I couldn't understand. Clipped and sharp. Coming from inside our pocket. Inside. The voice was so close I could have reached out and touched whoever was speaking. Then a scuffle. Bodies in sand. The thick, dull sound of a rifle butt hitting something softer than wood. And a Marine's voice, breathless and shaking. Got one. I got one. He was right. He was right next to me. He was right. Quiet, Harkin said. One word. The Marine went silent. The infiltrators weren't trying to overrun us. They were probing, testing our lines, finding the gaps, mapping our positions by drawing fire and noting where the muzzle flashes came from. It was methodical, professional, the work of soldiers who knew this island in the dark, the way I knew the hallways of my mother's house, who could move through coral and sand and shattered timber without making a sound because they'd been living in this terrain for months, digging it, shaping it, sleeping in it. And we were the intruders. Huddled in holes we'd scraped that afternoon, on ground we'd paid for with blood we couldn't spare, trying to hold a pocket that existed on no map and had no name, while the island's true inhabitants moved through the darkness around us like ghosts with grenades. The next probe came at the eastern edge, a single figure, low and fast, darting between craters. Gage's team saw him, or thought they did, and fired a burst that lit up the position. In the muzzle flash, I saw the figure drop, but I also saw something else. Two more figures, further back, moving in the opposite direction. The first man had been bait. The others were the real probe, and our fire had shown them exactly where Gage's team was dug in. A grenade arced out of the darkness and landed in the crater next to Gage's position. The explosion was muffled by sand, but the fragments weren't, and I heard Gage's voice. Tight, controlled, reporting. 2 wounded. We're pulling back to the secondary hole. There was no secondary hole. There was just another scrape in the coral 3 yards behind the first one. And pulling back to it meant giving up 3 yards of ground that had cost us all afternoon to take. Haskell crawled to my position. His jaw wound had swollen in the hours since morning, distorting his face into a mask that looked carved from something harder than flesh. He took the handset from me. Battalion, this is Haskell, Fox Company. We are under counter-infiltration. Multiple probes from north and east, requesting illumination, star shells, anything that puts light on this island. Over. The ship's response was immediate. They'd been waiting for the call. Within minutes, a naval gun offshore fired a star shell that arced over Betio and burst into a harsh white light that swung beneath its parachute like a slow, sickening pendulum. Shadows leaped and shifted as the flare descended, and in its swaying glow I saw the island for the first time as a single terrible photograph. The pocket, our pocket. 31 men in holes that looked like open graves, surrounded by a moonscape of craters and debris and the low humps of bunkers that were still alive, still occupied, still watching. Between our holes and theirs, the gaps we couldn't cover, I saw movement. 3 shapes, no, 4, low to the ground, frozen in the sudden light like deer in headlamps, and for one suspended second, everyone on both sides simply stared at each other across 15 yards of sand. Then everything fired at once. The noise was annihilating. Our rifles, their rifles, the flat crack of a knee mortar launching from somewhere behind the bunker line, the heavy thud of a machine gun opening up from a position we hadn't known existed to our west. Tracers crossed in the air like burning wire. Sand erupted in geysers. The star shell swung on its parachute, making the shadows dance, and in that strobing half-light, the battle dissolved into fragments. A muzzle flash here, a running figure there, the sound of a man grunting as something hit him. I flattened in my hole and covered the radio with my body. The handset was still keyed, the channel still open, and whatever the ship heard on the other end of that frequency was the raw, unfiltered sound of men trying to kill each other in the dark. It lasted 2 minutes, maybe 3. Then the star shell burned out, and the darkness crashed back, and the firing tapered to single shots, men squeezing rounds at the last place they'd seen movement, hoping to hit something, terrified of the silence that was already settling back over the island like a blanket thrown over a cage. Report, Haskell said. The reports came in by whisper. Gage's team, 2 wounded, both ambulatory. The north position, 1 dead. A Marine named Inman, hit in the throat by a fragment, dead before Pelletier could reach him. The southern foxholes, intact but rattled, 1 man firing so many rounds that his barrel was too hot to touch. And the infiltrators, gone, melted back into the dark, into the bunkers and trenches and tunnels they knew by touch, carrying with them a perfect map of our positions drawn in muzzle flashes and starshell light. They'll be back, Harkin said. He was right. They came back at midnight, and again at 0200, and again at 0330. Each probe was different direction, different method, different combination of grenades and crawling men, and decoy sounds. Each probe cost us something, ammunition we couldn't replace, sleep we couldn't afford, men who started the night as soldiers and were becoming something rawer, something filed down to nerve and reflex and the animal knowledge that the dark was full of things that wanted them dead. Between probes, the silence was the worst part. Not because it was quiet. It wasn't. The island made sounds all night, the creak of damaged structures settling, The soft hiss of sand shifting in craters. The distant groan of a wounded man somewhere outside our perimeter, Japanese or American, impossible to tell, his voice rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded almost like prayer. I sat with the radio and listened to the frequencies. Other units were enduring the same night, the same probes, the same grenades, the same slow erosion of men and morale in a darkness that seemed engineered to break the human mind. A unit on Red Beach 3 reported a full banzai charge at 0100, 30 Japanese soldiers rushing their position with bayonets and swords, and the transmission devolved into screaming and gunfire before cutting to static. When it came back, the voice was different, calmer. Position held. 11 enemy KIA in the wire. 4 of ours gone. 4 more, added to the hundreds already floating in the lagoon, already stacked behind the seawall, already buried in craters that served as both fighting positions and graves. The arithmetic of Betio was simple and merciless. Every hour, the numbers got smaller, and the island didn't care which side was doing the subtracting. Around 0400, Kurrigan appeared beside my foxhole. I hadn't heard him approach. He moved through the pocket with the same silence the infiltrators used, as if he'd already absorbed something of the island's nature. His arm was stiff, the bandage dark with dried blood, and his face in the pre-dawn murk was a collection of angles and shadows that made him look 10 years older than the man who'd crawled over the seawall that morning. "I need to tell you something," he said. I waited. The satchel charge. The last one. He paused. I checked it during the last probe. The detonators cracked. Moisture from the wade, probably. I can fix it, I think. But if it doesn't fire, we've got nothing left to crack bunkers with. Nothing left. No satchels. No bangalores. No flamethrowers. The resupply track that was supposed to reach us at high tide hadn't come, hit on the reef, or rerouted, or simply lost in the chaos of a battle that had outgrown every plan designed to contain it. We had rifles and grenades and bayonets, and ahead of us lay an island armored in concrete and coconut logs and the bodies of men who had decided to die here long before we decided to take it from them. "Can you fix it?" I asked. "I'll know by dawn." Dawn. The word felt impossible. This night had the weight of something permanent, a darkness that would never lift, a silence between the probes that stretched like a held breath the island would never release. But the eastern horizon was already changing, not lighter, not yet, but softer, the black shifting to something with depth, and in that shift I could feel the shape of the next day forming like a bruise. A runner arrived from the south, a kid, breathing hard, his eyes white in the darkness. He carried a message from the battalion CP that had been established near the pier, written on a scrap of paper, folded twice, the handwriting barely legible in the pre-dawn gray. Haskell read it. His jaw worked. The swelling distorted whatever expression he was trying to make, but his eyes were readable, and what I saw in them was the particular blend of fury and resignation that comes from receiving orders that confirm your worst fears. He handed me the paper. I read it by the faint glow of the radio's indicator light, tilting the scrap until the words resolved. Day 2 orders. All units push inland. Seize assigned objectives. Naval gunfire and air support will be provided. Reinforcements landing at high tide. Expect heavy resistance. The island must be taken. That was it. No specifics, no adjusted timeline, no acknowledgement that the plan had died on the reef 18 hours ago and everything since then had been improvisation. Just a directive from men on ships to men in holes. Push forward. Take the island. Do it today. I looked at Harkin. His face was unreadable. "Same plan as yesterday," he said quietly. "Except yesterday we had demolitions and full ammunition and men who'd slept." Haskell folded the paper and put it in his pocket, as if preserving it for a record that someone would someday read. "We push at first light," he said. "Same method, bunker by bunker. Kurrigan fixes that charge, or we do it with grenades and fire. I don't care if we take 10 yards or 100. We push." He looked at each of us. Harkin, Kurrigan, Gage, with his 2 wounded men, me, with my radio and my frequency list and my voice that connected 31 survivors to a fleet that couldn't reach them. "The island doesn't get to keep us pinned," Haskell said. "We came here to take it. That hasn't changed." Nobody argued. Nobody agreed. We just sat in our holes and watched the eastern sky lighten, degree by degree, and felt the darkness release its grip on Betio, the way a fist unclenches, slowly, grudgingly, and not all at once. The first sliver of sun broke the horizon and lit the lagoon in shades of gold and gray. In that light, the waiting corridor was visible again. The stalled boats, the debris, the dark shapes that rocked gently in the incoming tide. And on the reef, something new, landing craft. A dozen of them loaded low, engines grinding, pushing toward the island on a tide that had finally risen high enough to carry them over the coral. Reinforcements. Fresh men with full ammunition and dry weapons, and the particular ignorance of soldiers who haven't yet seen what this island does to plans and timetables and the human body. I watched them come and felt nothing that resembled hope. What I felt was older than hope and heavier. It was the knowledge that those men in those boats were about to learn what we'd learned in the waiting corridor, and at the seawall, and in the bunker lanes, and in the dark, that Betio didn't surrender ground, it only rented it, and the rent was due again today. Kerrigan opened his kit and spread the cracked detonator on a flat piece of coral, studying it with fingers that were steadier than they had any right to be. The Zippo sat beside it like a surgical instrument. "I can fix it," he said. Not to me, to himself. A promise made in the first light of a day that would demand everything he had left. The sun rose over an island that should have fallen in 3 hours and hadn't fallen in 26. And the real war, the inch by inch, bunker by bunker, body by body war, was only beginning. The sun on the second day was not the same sun. It rose the same way, eastern horizon, gold spilling across the lagoon, but what it illuminated had changed so fundamentally that the light itself seemed hostile. Yesterday's sun had lit a beach we were trying to reach. Today's sun lit a graveyard we were standing in, and it did so without pity, without shade, without the faintest suggestion that anything on this island deserved relief. By 0800 the temperature was already unbearable. Not warm, weaponized, the equatorial heat settled over Betio like a fever, pressing down on the sand and coral and shattered concrete until the air itself shimmered and the horizon wobbled like something seen through bad glass. The water in my canteen was gone, had been gone since midnight. My tongue felt like a strip of leather glued to the roof of my mouth, and every swallow was a dry click that reminded me the human body was just a machine that ran on fluid and mine was running out. Haskell pushed the first team forward at 073. 4 men, moving in a low crouch through the crater field north of our pocket, heading toward a bunker complex that aerial photos had labeled Position 14 and that Kerrigan simply called the next one. The advance was measured not in yards but in reference points: the wrecked Amtrak hull, the palm stump split lengthwise by a shell, the crater with the Japanese helmet sitting on its rim like a marker left by someone who wanted to be found. They made it 30 yards before the firing started. It came from 2 directions, the target bunker ahead and a position to the northwest that we hadn't identified. A low emplacement buried under sand and debris that had survived the naval bombardment by virtue of being invisible. The crossfire caught the lead man mid-stride. He went down without a sound, folding at the waist as if someone had pulled a string. The other 3 dove into the nearest crater and pressed flat, while rounds cracked overhead in a rhythm that was almost mechanical. Burst, pause, the Japanese gunners conserving ammunition with a discipline that bordered on the surgical. Contact north and northwest, Harkin relayed to me, and I relayed it to the ships, and the ships acknowledged. And somewhere in the chain between my voice and their guns, the urgency was translated into something calmer, more procedural, more suited to men standing in air-conditioned compartments reading dials instead of bleeding in sand. Foxtrot 7. We can provide 5-inch on the northwest position. Confirm coordinates. I looked at Harkin. Harkin looked at the ground. The northwest position was 40 yards from our pocket and maybe 30 yards from the fire team trapped in the crater. A 5-inch naval shell had a blast radius that didn't care about uniforms. If the round fell short, it would hit our men. If it fell long, it would hit our pocket. Tight, Harkin said. Tell them tight. I told them tight. The word meant nothing in gunnery terms. The margin of error on a 5-inch gun fired from a moving ship 2 miles offshore was measured in dozens of yards, not inches. But I said it because Harkin needed me to say it, and the men in the crater needed to believe that someone on the other end of the radio understood what tight meant when your people were the margin. The shell came in high and fast, the whistle building from a whisper to a scream, and it struck the sand 30 yards north of the hidden position. Close, not close enough. Sand and coral erupted, and the concussion wave rippled across the flat ground like a visible thing, bending the heat shimmer, but the bunker's firing didn't stop. The second round was adjusted, right 10, drop 5, and it landed closer, shaking the earth hard enough that I felt it in my teeth. The third round hit the edge of the emplacement, and something inside it detonated, a secondary explosion, ammunition or a fuel store, and a pillar of black smoke and fire climbed into the morning sky. The northwest position went quiet. "Move," Haskell shouted, and the fire team in the crater surged forward, while the target bunker ahead was still adjusting to the loss of its flanking support. They covered 10 yards, 15. Then the target bunker opened up again, a single machine gun, sweeping the ground in front of its slit, and they went down again, pressing into a shallow depression that offered cover measured in inches. This was the rhythm of day 2. Not a battle, a negotiation. We offered fire and movement. The island countered with interlocking positions and pre-sighted kill zones. We called in naval shells and bought 30 seconds of suppression. The island waited for the suppression to end and started killing again. Every gain was a transaction, and the currency was men. Kerrigan had fixed the detonator. I don't know how he'd worked on it through the last hours of darkness, with the focus of a watchmaker, using a needle from Pelletier's medical kit and a strand of copper wire stripped from the radio's spare antenna. When he showed it to Haskell at dawn, his face carried the grim satisfaction of a man who solved a problem that shouldn't have been solvable. "One charge," he said. "One shot. It has to be the right bunker." The right bunker was position 14, the one currently pinning down our fire team. It was the anchor of the Japanese defensive line in our sector, and every other position in the area depended on its fields of fire. Kill it, and the adjacent bunkers would lose their interlocking coverage. Miss it, and we'd spent our last demolition for nothing. Kerrigan studied the bunker through a gap in our perimeter. The emplacement was a mound of coconut logs and reinforced sand, maybe 8 feet high, with a firing slit facing south-southwest and a secondary aperture, barely visible, angled to the east. The logs were blackened from near misses but intact. The concrete beneath them was scarred but unbreached. It had been built to survive exactly what we'd thrown at it, and it had. "I need to come from the east," Kerrigan said. "The secondary slit is narrower, harder for the gunner to traverse. If I approach along the crater line from that angle, I'll be in his peripheral vision, not his primary arc." "That's 60 yards of open ground," Harkin said. 53. I counted. He had. He'd counted the distance by reference points, crater to palm, stump to debris pile, to bunker wall, the way a surveyor measures land, except this land was measured in probability of death per yard, and 53 yards at those odds was a math problem with no good answer. Haskell organized the support. Same drill as yesterday. Smoke, suppressive fire, naval shells, but with fewer men, less ammunition, and a weariness that had seeped into every muscle and every decision. The fire teams moved into position with the slow deliberation of men conserving energy they couldn't replenish. Canteens were empty. Rations were gone. Some men had eaten nothing since the transport ship. Their bodies were running on adrenaline and habit and the stubborn refusal to die on an island whose name they couldn't have found on a map 2 weeks ago. I called the ships. Foxtrot 7 requesting 5-inch suppressive fire on position 14, coordinates. Harkin's numbers, precise as always. Time on target. On my call. Will be followed by ground assault. Danger close. Repeat, danger close. The gunnery officer paused. Foxtrot 7. Confirm danger close. Confirmed. 50 yards. We know. We knew. We also knew that without the shells, Kerrigan would be crossing open ground against an emplacement with 2 firing arcs and no suppression. The 5-inch rounds were the only thing that could make the gunner inside duck, and ducking was all we needed. 3 seconds, maybe 5. A window measured in heartbeats. On my call, I said, standing by. Kerrigan moved into position. I couldn't see him. He'd crawled east through a drainage ditch that ran along the edge of our pocket, a shallow channel carved by runoff that was barely deep enough to hide a man lying flat. He'd taken the satchel charge and his Zippo and nothing else, and the last I'd seen of him was the sole of his boot disappearing into the ditch like a man being swallowed. Haskell gave the signal. I keyed the handset. Fire. The first shell hit 40 yards north of the bunker. A deliberate overshoot to walk the fire in. The second was closer. The third struck the bunker's northern face, and the explosion sent a shockwave through the ground that I felt in my hip bones. Smoke and debris engulfed the position. Our rifles opened up, every man in the pocket who had a clear line, pouring rounds into the smoke, filling the air around the bunker with so much metal that breathing inside it would be an act of faith. Kerrigan ran. I didn't see him run. I heard about it afterward from Gage. who had a partial line of sight from his crater. He said Kerrigan came out of the ditch at a dead sprint. Not the crouch run of yesterday, but a full upright dash, the satchel charge in his left hand, because his right arm was too stiff from the wound to grip. He covered the first 30 yards before the smoke began to thin. At 40 yards, the bunker's secondary slit opened fire. Short bursts, the gunner firing blind through the haze, and Kerrigan changed direction without slowing, cutting right and then left in a pattern that looked random but was probably calculated, each step landing in the impression left by a previous shell burst where the ground was soft and gave way under his boots. At 50 yards, he went down. For a terrible second, I thought he'd been hit. The radio was alive with voices. "Kerrigan's down, Kerrigan's down." And I almost broke channel to relay it to battalion before Gage's voice cut through, breathless and sharp. "No, he tripped. He's up. He's moving." Kerrigan was up. He'd stumbled on a chunk of rebar half buried in the sand, gone to one knee, and pushed himself back to his feet with the satchel charge still clutched in his damaged arm. The bunker's slit was 10 yards ahead. The gunner inside had found the range now. Rounds kicked sand around Kerrigan's feet in a tightening circle, and in the last 5 yards he stopped running and started sliding, dropping to his knees and letting momentum carry him across the sand like a man sliding into home plate. He hit the bunker wall. Same position as yesterday. Pressed flat against the base, below the slit, in the blind spot where the weapon couldn't depress. But this time the secondary aperture was 3 feet above his head, not beside him, and he had to stand to reach it. He stood. He lit the fuse. He shoved the charge upward, through the narrow slit, with the one arm that still worked properly, while the other hung at his side shaking. Fire in the hole. The explosion was different this time, heavier, deeper. A sound that came from the earth itself rather than the air. The bunker's roof lifted 6 inches and dropped back, and black smoke poured from both slits like exhaled breath. Then a secondary detonation, the ammunition inside cooking off, and the mound caved inward, the coconut logs snapping like bones, the sand collapsing into the void where the fighting compartment had been. Kerrigan didn't run back this time. He walked, slowly, carefully, one arm cradling the other, his face empty of everything except the knowledge that the charge had worked, and there were no more left. He walked back through the smoke and the settling debris, and the sudden silence of a position that had been killing men for 30 hours and would never kill again. When he reached our pocket, he sat down in the nearest crater and didn't speak for a long time. The loss of position 14 changed the geometry of our sector, the way pulling a keystone changes an arch. The bunkers to the east and west were still active, still firing, but without the anchor position's interlocking coverage, their fields of fire no longer meshed. Gaps appeared, lanes of ground where a man could move without entering a kill zone, and Haskell exploited them with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that momentum on Betio lasted minutes, not hours. Teams pushed forward through the gaps. The advance was ugly, crawling, sprinting, diving into craters, taking fire from positions we could suppress but not destroy. Without demolitions, every surviving bunker was a problem that could only be solved by grenades thrown through slits, or by getting close enough to fire point blank into the apertures, or by simply bypassing the position and hoping the defenders inside would be cut off from supply and support. Some bunkers were bypassed. Some were reduced by grenade assault. 3 men approaching from different angles, each throwing in sequence, the overlapping blasts creating a concussion inside the concrete box that killed or stunned the occupants. Some were dealt with by methods I don't want to describe and couldn't watch and heard only as sounds, specific, terrible sounds carried on the hot, still air of an afternoon that seemed to last forever. By midday, the pocket had expanded to something that almost earned the word perimeter. Our 31 men had been reinforced by elements from the morning wave. Marines who'd crossed the reef on the high tide, waded through water that was shallower now, but no less deadly, and reached the seawall with the wide-eyed disbelief of men who'd been told the beachhead was established and found instead a thin line of survivors crouched behind concrete. I briefed each new group as they arrived, which meant I stood in a crater with the radio and told them the truth. The plan was bunker by bunker. The demolitions were gone, the water was gone, the ammunition was lower than anyone wanted to admit, and the island had a lot more concrete left than we had men. They listened. Some of them looked at me the way you'd look at a man describing a car accident he'd survived, with sympathy and distance, and the private belief that it wouldn't happen to them. Others looked at the sand around our positions, the blast marks, the bloodstains, the shallow graves already dug for men who'd died that morning, and understood immediately that the briefing was unnecessary because the ground was telling them everything I could. Haskell coordinated the push with adjacent units through the radio. Our sector was one piece of a line that stretched across the island's narrow waist, and the line was advancing slowly, unevenly, with gaps and bulges that looked on no map like progress, but felt on the ground like a slow-motion collision with something immovable. The Japanese defenders didn't retreat. They died in their positions or fell back to the next prepared line and died there. Every yard of ground was contested. Every bunker was a battle. Every battle had a cost. The naval gunfire continued. Sporadic now, targeted, called in by radio men like me, who'd become the battle's nervous system, translating the chaos of ground combat into coordinates that ships could use. But the calls for fire support were outpacing the ship's ability to respond. Every unit on the island was requesting shells. Every request was urgent. The gunnery officers offshore were performing triage of their own, deciding which request to answer, which unit to support, which sector of the island would get the 5-inch rounds that might be the difference between a stalled advance and a breakthrough. Our sector got fewer shells as the afternoon wore on. The priority had shifted north, where a larger force was attempting to push across the airfield that bisected the island. I heard the transmissions, heavy contact, high casualties, coordinated Japanese counterattack, and understood that our pocket, our tiny perimeter carved out of the island's southern flank, had become a secondary effort. We were still fighting. We were still dying. But the battle's center of gravity had moved, and we were on the periphery now, grinding forward without the support that had made the morning's gains possible. Foxtrot 7, be advised. Fire support reduced to emergency calls only for your sector. Priority is airfield access. Acknowledge. I acknowledged. Harkin heard it. He didn't react visibly, but something behind his eyes shifted. A recalculation, the mental arithmetic of a man who's just been told the supply of miracles has been cut. Same plan, he said. Grenades and rifles, old-fashioned. Old-fashioned. On an island where the defenders had built fortifications that laughed at grenades and rifles, old-fashioned was a euphemism for more men will die. But it was also the only option left, and Harkin was not a man who wasted time mourning options that didn't exist. The afternoon ground on. The heat was a living thing now, a predator that stalked every man on the island, regardless of uniform. I saw Marines pour sand into their helmets to create shade for their necks. I saw men hold pebbles in their mouths to stimulate saliva because there was no water and the dehydration was turning muscles to stone and thoughts to static. I saw Pelletier treat a man for heat exhaustion and then lean against a palm stump and nearly collapse from it himself, catching himself with a hand that shook so badly it took him 3 tries to close his medical kit. I was no better. The radio weighed 30 pounds, and those 30 pounds had been on my back or in my arms for 36 hours. My shoulders were raw where the straps had worn through my shirt. My fingers were cracked from coral and salt. The handset was slick with sweat I couldn't spare, and every transmission required a concentration that felt like lifting something heavy with a muscle that was failing. But the radio worked. It still worked. And as long as it worked, I was the thread that connected this pocket of men to the ships and the supplies and the reinforcements that might, if the tide was right, if the reef cooperated, if the Amtraks held together, reach us before the island finished what it had started. A runner came in from the south at 1600. He carried a message written on the back of a ration box, the cardboard soft with humidity and sweat. Haskell read it, and for the first time all day his expression changed. Not to hope, not to relief, but to something that looked almost like surprise. He handed me the cardboard. I read it. Resupply. Amtrak en route. Your position. Ita, high tide approx 1730. Contents. Ammunition. Water. Demolitions. Medical. Hold current line. Hold current line. We'd been holding the current line all day. We'd been holding it since yesterday. But the word demolitions, that single word, written in grease pencil on damp cardboard, changed the equation. Demolitions meant satchel charges. Satchel charges meant bunkers could die. Bunkers dying meant ground could be taken. Ground taken meant this island might, eventually in some future that felt as distant as the stars, actually fall. Kerrigan was asleep in his crater. Real sleep, the deep unconscious collapse of a body that had burned through every reserve and simply stopped. I didn't wake him. The Amtrak would come or it wouldn't, and the demolitions would arrive or they wouldn't, and nothing Kerrigan could do in the next 90 minutes would change those facts. So I let him sleep while the island burned and bled around him, and I watched the tide creep up the reef, inch by inch, carrying with it the possibility of one more day. The radio crackled. Foxtrot 7, be advised. Enemy counterattack expected tonight, all sectors. Consolidate positions. Conserve ammunition. Prepare for sustained close combat. I looked at Harkin. He looked at the sky. The sun already angling west. The shadows already lengthening. The darkness already gathering at the edges of the day like something patient. Same as last night, he said. Except now they know exactly where we are. The Amtrak came in on the tide like an answer to a prayer nobody had the energy to speak. I heard it before I saw it. The grinding churn of treads biting water. The labored whine of an engine that had already survived more than its designers had promised. It came from the south, threading a gap in the reef that hadn't existed at low tide, riding the high water that had finally, after 52 hours of refusing, risen enough to carry a loaded vehicle over the coral shelf that had murdered the first wave. It was 1740. The sun was an hour from setting, and the Amtrak was the most beautiful machine I'd ever seen, not because of what it was, but because of what it carried. It ground up onto the beach with a shudder that sent sand spraying from its treads, and before the engine had fully died, men were swarming it. The hatches opened, and inside was everything we'd been dying without. Crates of .30 caliber ammunition still in their factory grease, 5-gallon water cans sweating with condensation, satchel charges, 4 of them packed in waterproof canvas, Bangalore torpedoes, grenades, medical supplies in sealed tins, and a flamethrower, a single M2, its twin tanks gleaming with a dull olive menace that made Kerrigan, who'd been shaken awake by Gage, stare at it the way a carpenter stares at the tool he's been missing. I drank first. I'm not ashamed of it. The water hit my cracked throat like something electric, and for 3 swallows I forgot the island, forgot the bunkers, forgot the dead men floating in the lagoon. Then the water reached my stomach and it cramped so hard I doubled over, and Pelletier was beside me saying, slow, small sips with the patience of a man who'd been treating dehydration all day and had finally been given something to treat it with. The supplies moved through the pocket in a controlled rush, Haskell directing distribution with the efficiency of a man who understood that every minute the ammunition sat in crates was a minute the enemy could mortar the Amtrak and take it all away. Magazines were loaded, canteens were filled, satchel charges were handed to Kerrigan, who inspected each one with his watchmaker's focus, checking detonators, testing fuses, running his thumb along the seals with a touch so gentle it looked almost tender. 4 charges, he said. And the flamethrower. That's 8, maybe 10 bunkers if we're smart. There are more than 10 bunkers left, Harkin said. Then we'll have to be very smart. But the Amtrak hadn't come alone. Behind it, riding the same high tide, came landing craft. Not the flat-bottomed LCVPs that had died on the reef yesterday, but LCMs with deeper drafts that could clear the coral when the water was right. They came in a ragged line, engines straining, and they carried men, fresh Marines from the Reserve Battalion. Men who'd spent 30 hours on transport ships watching the island burn and listening to the radio traffic and knowing that what waited for them on the beach was nothing like what the briefings had described. They came over the gunwales and into waist-deep water, and this time the wade was shorter, 200 yards instead of 500, but it wasn't safe. Japanese positions that had survived 2 days of bombardment still had lines of fire into the lagoon, and the fresh Marines learned the island's first lesson before their boots touched sand, that Betio killed you for moving and killed you for standing still, and the only question was how many steps you got before the math caught up. I watched them come in from our perimeter, watched them stagger onto the beach, some of them falling behind the seawall the way we had, grateful, gasping, pressing their faces against concrete that stank of blood and cordite. Watched their eyes as they took in the landscape behind the wall, the craters, the shattered palms, the low dark shapes of bunkers, the smell that 2 days of fighting in equatorial heat had produced, a smell that I'd stopped noticing but that hit the fresh men like a physical force. A staff sergeant from the reinforcements found Haskell's position and dropped into our crater. He was clean-shaven. His dungarees were dry. His canteen was full. He looked at Haskell's swollen jaw, at Harkin's sand-crusted face, at my radio with its cracked casing and salt-corroded handset, and I watched the understanding arrive in his eyes like a tide coming in, slow at first, then all at once. "What's the situation?" he asked. Haskell looked at him for a long moment. Then he pointed inland at the bunkers, at the crater field, at the wreckage that had once been organized defensive positions and was now a landscape of individual fortresses, each one a self-contained killing machine, connected to the next by trenches and tunnels and fields of fire that overlapped like scales on a snake. "We're buying ground by the yard," Haskell said. "The demolitions you brought are the only thing that changes the rate." The staff sergeant, his name was Pollard, and he'd been in the Corps for 12 years and had the particular steadiness of a man who'd survived enough to know what surviving looked like, nodded once. He didn't offer suggestions. He didn't second guess. He looked at the terrain, looked at the men, looked at the map that Harkin had been scratching in the sand for 2 days, and said, "Show me the next target." Harkin showed him. The Japanese defensive line in our sector had been cracked. Position 14 was gone, the northwest emplacement was destroyed, several smaller positions had been reduced by grenade assault, but ahead of us, spanning the island's narrowing waist like a belt of concrete, lay a line of mutually supporting bunkers that the briefing maps called the main defensive zone. It was the spine of the island's resistance, the last coordinated line before the eastern tail of Betio, where the terrain narrowed and the defenders would be compressed into a shrinking perimeter. "If we break that line," Harkin said, "everything east of it becomes isolated. They can still fight, but they can't coordinate. They become individual positions instead of a system. And the line is anchored by what?" Harkin pointed to a cluster of emplacements, 400 yards ahead. 3 bunkers, interlocking fire, connected by a trench system that lets them reinforce each other. The center one is the biggest, concrete and steel, not just coconut log. That's the spine. Kerrigan was already listening. He sat on the edge of the crater with his 4 satchel charges arranged in front of him like a surgeon's instruments. The flamethrower lay beside them, its tanks checked, its igniter tested. Beside Kerrigan sat Corporal Wyatt, the flamethrower operator from Pollard's unit, a broad-shouldered man from Alabama who handled the 70-pound weapon with an ease that suggested he'd carried heavier things for worse reasons. "The flamethrower takes the trench," Kerrigan said. "Clear the connecting passage so they can't reinforce. Then Satchel charges on the bunkers, one at a time, outside in. Kill the flanks first, then the center. That's 3 charges for 3 bunkers," Harkin said, "and 1 spare. If it works. If not, the spare is insurance." "And if it doesn't work?" Kerrigan didn't answer that. He picked up the first charge, checked the detonator one more time, and stood up. Haskell organized the assault with everything we had. The original survivors, what was left of us, formed the suppressive fire teams. Pollard's fresh Marines would provide the assault element. Kerrigan and Wyatt would do the demolition work. I would stay on the radio and coordinate naval fire for the flanking positions. It was the largest coordinated action our sector had attempted. 40-some men moving together toward a fortified line, with fire support from the ships and every weapon we could bring to bear. It was also, I understood as I watched the teams form up, probably the only chance we'd get. The ammunition from the resupply would last hours, not days. The water would last less. If we didn't break the line today, we'd be back to yesterday's arithmetic. Too few men, too little ordnance, too many bunkers, except weaker, thinner, more brittle. "On my signal," Haskell said. His voice was steady, but his eyes moved fast, scanning the terrain ahead, calculating distances and angles, running the geometry one last time. "Kerrigan, Wyatt, you don't move until I say. The suppressive fire has to be established first. If you run into an active field of fire, we lose the demolitions and we lose the day." Kerrigan nodded. Wyatt adjusted the flamethrower's straps and didn't say anything. I keyed the radio. "Foxtrot 7 to fire support. Coordinated assault on main defensive zone, our sector. Requesting 5-inch on flanking positions. Grid." I read off Harkin's numbers. "Time on target. My call. This is the push. Everything you've got." The gunnery officer, the same younger voice from yesterday. A little less steady now, a little more aware of what his shells were landing in, acknowledged. "Standing by, Foxtrot 7. All guns allocated your sector for the next 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That was our window. 15 minutes of dedicated naval gunfire, after which the guns would shift to another sector, another crisis, another cluster of men in holes asking for the same thing we were asking for. 15 minutes to break a fortified line that had been built over months by men who'd expected to die behind it." Haskell raised his arm, held it. The teams tensed, bodies coiled in craters and behind debris, weapons up, every eye on the bunkers ahead. The silence before action is a specific silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of intention, a collective held breath that makes the air feel thicker. His arm dropped. "Fire." I keyed the handset. "Fire mission, execute." Everything happened at once. The naval shells screamed in, 4, 5, 6 rounds in rapid succession, walking across the flanking positions in a curtain of steel and high explosive that turned the sand into a boiling cloud. Our rifles opened up, 40 weapons, every caliber we had, pouring fire into the bunker slits. The noise was beyond noise. It was a physical state, a condition of the air, a vibration that entered the body through the bones and shook thoughts loose from their moorings. Wyatt moved first. He came out of a crater at a crouch run. The flamethrower's nozzle held in front of him like a lance. He reached the trench, the connecting passage between the bunkers, and fired. The stream of liquid fire hit the trench entrance and poured inside like water filling a pipe. The flame didn't splash or scatter. It flowed, clinging to the walls, filling the narrow space with a heat so intense that the sand on the trench's lip glassed over. Something inside the trench screamed. A sound I will carry to my grave and beyond, a sound that has no place in the vocabulary of any language because the human voice was never meant to make it. The screaming lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, and then it stopped, and what came out of the trench was smoke that smelled like nothing else on earth. Wyatt fired again. A second burst, deeper into the passage. The trench was severed. Whatever connection had linked the 3 bunkers was now a tunnel of fire that no human body could pass through. The bunkers were isolated. Each one was alone now, cut off from reinforcement, alone with whatever ammunition and men it contained and nothing else. Kerrigan went for the eastern bunker first, the smaller of the 2 flanking positions. He moved in a sprint I didn't think his body could still produce, covering the ground between our line and the bunker wall in a dead run that lasted maybe 6 seconds. He hit the wall, pressed flat, lit the fuse, placed the charge through the slit. The routine was practiced now, a choreography of violence he'd performed twice before, and that had become, through repetition, something almost like craft. The charge detonated. The bunker died. Kerrigan was already moving. The western bunker was harder. Its slit faced our line directly, and the gunner inside had watched the eastern position die and knew what was coming. He poured fire into the space between our line and his wall, with the desperate focus of a man who understood he was next. Rounds kicked up a continuous curtain of sand that made the approach look like running into a waterfall. Pollard's men provided the suppression, concentrated fire from 5 rifles into the 8-inch slit, a needle-threading exercise that required each man to put rounds within inches of an opening 30 yards away while prone in sand. Not every round hit the slit, but enough did. Enough metal screaming through that narrow gap to make the gunner pull back, to create a flinch, a hesitation, a heartbeat of reduced fire that opened a lane. Kerrigan took it. He ran the lane the way a man runs through a gap in traffic, committed, total, no room for second thoughts. He reached the wall, lit the fuse, placed the charge, fire in the hole. The detonation collapsed the bunker's forward face. The slit disappeared under an avalanche of concrete and coconut log. The machine gun went silent, not gradually, not in a tapering burst, but instantly, completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. 2 down. The center bunker remained. It was the largest emplacement in the line. Reinforced concrete walls, steel rail bracing, a firing slit that was wider than the others, and mounted what sounded like a heavy machine gun, the flat, authoritative hammer of a weapon that could cut a man in half at 300 yards. It had watched both flanking positions die, and it was still firing, still functional, still lethal. The trench behind it was choked with Wyatt's fire, but the bunker itself was intact. Its builders had known what they were doing. This was the position that was meant to survive everything else falling. Kerrigan had 2 charges left. He held one in each hand, looking at the center bunker with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not the clinical focus of the previous assaults, but something more personal. An acknowledgement that this one was different. "The slit's too wide," he said. "If I place a single charge, the blast will vent outward. I need both charges, one in the slit, one against the wall, detonating simultaneously. That means both fuses lit at the same time," Harkin said. "You can't place 2 charges and light 2 fuses before one of them blows." "I know. I need someone to light the second fuse." Silence. The specific silence of men understanding what was being asked. Place 2 charges against a bunker that was actively firing. Light 2 fuses. Run before the detonation. The math didn't work for one man. It barely worked for 2. "I'll do it," said a voice I didn't recognize. One of Pollard's Marines, a lance corporal whose name I didn't know and would learn only later, reading it in a citation I wasn't sure he deserved, because what he did wasn't heroism. It was something simpler and more complicated than heroism. It was a man stepping forward because the moment required a man to step forward, and he was the one whose legs moved first. His name was Harding. He was 22 years old, from a town in Oregon I've never visited. He took the second satchel charge from Kerrigan and held it the way you'd hold a child, close to his chest, firm but careful. "Stay on my left," Kerrigan said. "I take the slit, you take the wall. Right side, as low as you can place it. Light when I light, run when I run. Don't look back, don't look back," Harding repeated. It wasn't a question, it was a contract. I called the ships one more time. "Foxtrot 7, final fire mission, center bunker, everything, now." The shells came in like the end of the world, round after round, pounding the ground around the center bunker in a ring of explosions that shook the island to its coral bones. Smoke and dust and debris created a curtain so thick that the bunker disappeared behind it. Our rifles added to the wall of fire, every weapon in the sector converging on that one point, that one 8-foot mound of concrete and steel that was the last obstacle between us and the eastern half of the island. Kerrigan and Harding went together, side by side, through the smoke, running in a synchronization that looked rehearsed but wasn't. Two men moving at the same speed toward the same wall, with the same understanding that the margin between survival and vaporization was measured in the length of a fuse. They reached the bunker. Kerrigan went left, the slit. Harding went right, the wall. Through the smoke I saw two flares, twin sparks of Zippo light, one from Kerrigan's hand and one from a lighter I couldn't identify. Two fuses burning, two men turning, two bodies sprinting back through the smoke toward our lines with everything they had left in muscles that were running on nothing. They made it 12 yards before the charges blew. The double detonation was something I felt more than heard, a pressure wave that hit my chest like an open palm and pushed me backward in my foxhole. The center bunker's roof lifted, cracked and collapsed inward. Both walls bulged outward and then caved, the concrete fracturing along the steel rails in jagged lines that looked like the island itself was breaking. A column of dust and smoke rose 30 feet into the air, and when it cleared, the bunker was a ruin, a heap of rubble and twisted metal with no slit, no walls, no weapon, no life. Kerrigan was on his back in a crater, ears bleeding, eyes open, alive. Harding was face down in the sand, 10 yards closer to the bunker. For a terrible moment, nobody moved toward him. Then Pelletier was there, crawling through the debris, reaching Harding, turning him over. Alive, conscious. A fragment had opened his left shoulder to the bone, and his eardrums were blown, but he was breathing, and when Pelletier pressed a bandage against the wound, Harding's right hand came up and held it in place without being told. The line was broken. The 3 bunkers that had anchored the main defensive zone were rubble. The connecting trench was a charred passage that nothing could move through. The positions east of the line, the remaining emplacements and fighting holes that stretched to the tail of the island, were now isolated, cut off from coordination, each one a separate problem instead of a system. It didn't mean the fighting was over. It meant the fighting had changed. The Japanese defenders in the eastern positions would fight to the death. Every man, every bunker, every trench, because that was the order and because the island left no alternative. But they would fight alone, each position making its own stand, and the Marines pushing east would face determined resistance without facing the coordinated kill zones that had turned the first 2 days into a meat grinder. I reported it. Foxtrot 7 to battalion. Main defensive zone in our sector is broken. 3 anchor bunkers destroyed. Assault element advancing east. Request permission to push to island's eastern perimeter. The response came fast, faster than any response in 2 days. Foxtrot 7, push east. All units are pushing. The island is cracking. The island was cracking. I said the words to Haskell, and he nodded, and something passed across his battered face that might have been satisfaction if it hadn't been so close to exhaustion. He stood up, fully upright for the first time in hours, and looked east along the narrowing spine of Betio, where the smoke was still rising and the sound of fighting was changing from the concentrated roar of contested ground to the scattered popping of isolated engagements. "Push," he said. One word. The same word he'd been saying for 2 days, but different now. Lighter. Directed at something achievable, rather than something impossible. We pushed through the rubble of the defensive line, past the craters and the dead, and the debris of a battle that had consumed the island, the way fire consumes paper completely, leaving only ash and the memory of shape. The men moved forward with a momentum that hadn't existed before, not the desperate crawl of the first 2 days, but something steadier, something that resembled an advance instead of a survival exercise. I walked with the radio. My legs moved because they'd been moving for 52 hours and didn't know how to stop. The handset was in my hand, and the frequency was open, and the voices on the channel were changing. Less panic, more purpose, the communications of men who were taking ground instead of begging for it. Ahead of us, the island narrowed. Behind us, the wreckage of every position we'd taken stretched back to the seawall and the lagoon and the reef where it had all begun. The tide was coming in again, and the water covered the reef gently, as if trying to smooth over what had happened there, and it couldn't. Nothing could. We'd won. It felt like waking up from surgery, disoriented, damaged, unsure what had been removed. The island fell on the third day, and the silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. It came in pieces, not all at once, not a clean cessation like a switch being thrown, but a gradual subtraction. The heavy machine guns stopped first, their positions overrun or destroyed, and the absence of their rhythmic hammering left a hole in the air that felt almost like vertigo. Then the rifles thinned, scattered shots becoming sporadic, becoming singular, becoming nothing. The last mortar round landed somewhere on the eastern tail of the island at 1300, and after the echo faded and the debris settled, there was a moment, 5 seconds, maybe 10, when nothing on Betio made a sound that was made by human intention. I stood in a crater near the eastern shore and listened to that silence. And what I heard inside it was the sound of my own heartbeat, which surprised me because I'd stopped believing I had one. The final pockets had been reduced through the morning, isolated positions where Japanese defenders fought with a commitment that defied every instinct the human body possesses for self-preservation. They fought from holes and trenches and the wreckage of bunkers that had already been destroyed once, firing until their ammunition was gone, and then fighting with bayonets and sharpened stakes in their hands. Some emerged from positions we'd bypassed the day before, dugouts so well concealed that men had walked over them without knowing, and the defenders inside had waited, patient as stones until the moment arrived to die on their own terms. Each final engagement was its own small war. A trench here, a pillbox there, a spider hole that erupted with a single rifleman who fired 3 shots and was killed by 20. The mathematics of the endgame were grotesque. Dozens of Marines converging on positions held by 2 or 3 men, the overwhelming force necessary, not because the defenders were dangerous in a tactical sense, but because Betio had taught us, over 76 hours, that underestimating any position on this island was a mistake paid for in blood. So we brought everything to every fight, and the last defenders died under a weight of fire that was less a military action than a collective refusal to lose one more man to one more hole in the ground. Kerrigan was beside me when the last shot was fired. He didn't mark the moment. He was sitting on a chunk of concrete that had once been part of a command bunker, his damaged arm resting in a sling Pelletier had fashioned from a Japanese officer's belt, and he was holding the Zippo in his good hand, turning it over and over with his thumb on the dent. The lighter had no fluid left. It hadn't worked since the second day, but he held it the way a man holds a rosary, not for function but for the weight of it, the realness, the proof that something from before all of this still existed. "That's it," he said. I didn't answer, because I didn't know what it meant. The fighting was over. The island was taken. The objective, the airstrip that bisected Betio like a scar, the reason the entire operation existed, was in American hands. In a few days, engineers would repair the runway, and planes would land and take off, and Tarawa would become a stepping stone in a campaign that stretched across the Pacific toward an enemy homeland that was still years and thousands of miles away. The strategic purpose had been achieved. The briefing maps could be updated, the reports could be filed, the word secured could be transmitted to admirals and generals who would nod and turn their attention to the next island, the next reef, the next set of coordinates where young men would wade into water and walk toward guns. But standing on Betio after the silence fell, secured was a word that belonged to a language I no longer spoke. The island didn't feel secured. It felt emptied, hollowed out. A shell of coral and sand and concrete from which everything living had been extracted by force, leaving behind a residue of violence so thick it seemed to stain the air itself. I walked. I don't know why. The radio was still on my back. I couldn't bring myself to take it off, as if removing it would sever some connection I wasn't ready to lose, and I walked west, back along the path we'd fought through, retracing in minutes a distance that had taken 2 days to cross. The crater field looked different in the aftermath. Without the smoke and the firing and the constant need to identify cover, the landscape resolved into something almost geological, a terrain of blast holes and debris that could have been the surface of a dead planet. Craters overlapped craters. The sand was churned to a depth of 2 or 3 feet in places, mixed with fragments of concrete, metal, wood, fabric, and things I chose not to identify. The shattered palms stood like stripped masts, their trunks splintered white where shells had peeled the bark away, their crowns gone, their shade gone, every possibility of softness stripped from an island that had never offered much to begin with. The bunkers we destroyed were mounds of rubble now. Position 14, the anchor that Kerrigan had killed on the second day, was a depression in the earth filled with shattered concrete and twisted rebar, and walking past it I felt a strange vertigo, because the position that had seemed so massive and permanent while it was killing us was in death just a pile of broken material barely distinguishable from the landscape around it. That was the bunker's final lesson, that the things we build to kill with look, once broken, exactly like everything else we've broken. I reached the seawall, the concrete lip that had been our first shelter. Our coffin lid, Haskell had called it, was still there, still pocked with impact craters, still stained with the dark smears that had once been wet and urgent and were now dry and permanent. I put my hand on the wall and felt the rough surface under my palm, and for a moment I was back at hour 2, pressing my face against this concrete, breathing coral dust, listening to the water behind me fill with sounds I'd spend the rest of my life trying to unhear. Harkin found me there. He walked up without speaking and stood beside me, looking out at the lagoon. The reef was visible at low tide, a dark shelf beneath the turquoise water, and on it the wrecked remains of landing craft that would never move again. Some had been dragged clear by recovery teams. Most hadn't. They sat on the coral like monuments, their ramps down, their hulls punctured, their purpose fulfilled and destroyed in the same moment. The waiting corridor. I could see it, not the physical space, which was just water now, ordinary water reflecting ordinary light, but the corridor as it had existed at dawn on the first day. The 500 yards of chest-deep ocean that men had walked through while the island tore them apart. The bodies were mostly gone, collected by graves registration teams who'd followed the assault waves with the grim efficiency of men whose job begins where everyone else's ends. But not all of them were gone. Some had drifted to the reef's edge, caught in coral formations, and they lay in the shallow water in postures that looked almost peaceful, as if they'd decided to rest in the lagoon and simply never gotten up. I counted them without meaning to. 11 that I could see. 11 shapes in the water. Some face up, some face down, all of them still wearing the equipment they'd carried off the boats. The packs, the rifles, the helmets that had been useless against everything that had been aimed at them. 11 men who'd walked into the corridor and were still there, still making the crossing, still measuring the distance to a seawall they would never reach. How many? I asked Harkin. Not the 11 in the water, the total, all of them, everyone. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was flat, not emotionless but compressed, the voice of a man packing a large thing into a small space. They're saying 1,000, maybe more, in 76 hours. On an island you can walk across in 20 minutes. 1,000 men. On a spit of coral half a mile long and 800 yards wide. The density of it, the concentration of death in such a small space over such a short time, was a number that refused to become real. I could say it. I couldn't hold it. It was like trying to grip water. The shape of it kept changing, kept slipping through the structure of every framework I tried to contain it in. 1,000 men who'd been alive on the transport ships 3 days ago, who'd cleaned their rifles and written letters and made jokes about the briefing officer's pronunciation of Tarawa, who'd stood in chow lines and argued about baseball and looked at the island from the rail and thought whatever men think when they look at the place where their life might end, some with dread, some with bravado, most with a flat acceptance that was neither brave nor cowardly, but simply the posture of men who'd been told to go and were going, gone now, reduced to a number that would be refined and revised and eventually printed in a report that someone in Washington would read at a desk, in a room with air conditioning and coffee, and would perhaps pause over before turning to the next page. I sat down against the seawall. The concrete was warm from the afternoon sun. My back settled into the same spot it had occupied on the first morning, and the radio pressed against the wall behind me, with the dull familiarity of something that had become an extension of my body. I thought about taking it off. I thought about setting it down, disconnecting the handset, letting the frequency go to static. But I didn't. The radio had kept us connected to the ships, to battalion, to the abstract chain of command that had sent us here and would send us somewhere else. Turning it off felt like severing something I wasn't ready to sever, even though the battle was over and the frequency carried nothing now but routine traffic and the occasional crackle of empty air. Pelletier appeared from somewhere south. He walked slowly, the purposeful crawl of the past 3 days replaced by the heavy shuffle of a man whose body had finally presented the bill for everything it had done. His medical kit was empty, had been empty for a day and a half. He'd been working with salvaged supplies, captured materials, strips of cloth and lengths of wire, and the stubborn refusal to let a man die for want of a bandage. His hands, which had been red for 76 hours, were clean now. Someone had given him water to wash them, and the clean hands looked wrong on him, as if the blood had been a part of his skin that had been peeled away. He sat down beside me without speaking. We looked at the lagoon together. The water was absurdly beautiful, turquoise and clear, the kind of water that belonged in photographs on travel posters, not in the memory of men who'd watched it turn red. A small wave broke over the reef and hissed across the shallows, and the sound was so gentle, so ordinary, that it hurt more than any explosion had. "I lost count," Pelletier said. Not an admission, a fact. He'd lost count of the men he'd treated, the men he'd triaged, the men he'd touched on the forehead and lied to. The number had exceeded his ability to hold it, and he'd let it go somewhere during the second night, and now it was just a weight without a figure, a mass without a measure. "You kept people alive," I said. "Some of them. That's what you could do." He didn't respond. He pulled a cigarette from his breast pocket, the last one, bent and damp, and I gave him Kerrigan's Zippo, which had no fluid. And he looked at it, and I looked at it, and neither of us laughed because it wasn't funny. It was the kind of detail that war produces in abundance. The small, useless gesture, the empty tool, the reflex that continues after the need has passed. A Marine from Pollard's unit walked by and tossed Pelletier a book of matches without being asked, and Pelletier lit the cigarette and inhaled, and the smoke drifted out over the seawall toward the water. Haskell came last. He walked along the wall from the north, his jaw still swollen, his dungarees stiff with salt and blood and 2 days of sweat baked into the fabric by equatorial sun. He carried his sidearm in his hand, not raised, not holstered, just held, as if he'd forgotten it was there. When he reached us, he stood for a moment looking at the lagoon, then at the island behind us, then at the 3 of us sitting against the wall. "Secure," he said. The word came out thick through his damaged jaw. He said it once, to no one in particular, and then he sat down beside us and didn't say anything else. We sat there, 4 men against a wall, on a beach, on an island that had taken 76 hours to fall and would take a lifetime to leave. The sun was past its peak, sliding toward the western horizon, and the light had turned from white to gold, and the gold lay across the water and the sand and the wreckage with an indifference that felt almost like forgiveness. Almost, not quite. I thought about the radio, about the voices I'd carried, the requests for fire, for ammo, for corpsmen, for God, for anything that might stop the island from doing what it was doing. I'd been the mouth and the ear, the conduit between men who were dying and men who could help, and now the frequency was quiet, and the men were dead or alive, and my voice had done what it could, which was not enough, which was never enough, which was the only thing available. I thought about Kerrigan's Zippo, empty, dented, useless, carried from the first day to the last like a talisman. I thought about Harding's shoulder, open to the bone, and the way his hand had come up to hold the bandage without being told. I thought about Tolliver, folded over the wall on the first morning, the first man over, the first lesson. I thought about the kid who'd carried a dead man 200 yards through machine gun fire, because putting him down would have meant knowing what he already knew. I thought about the choice I'd made on the second night, the one I said I'd get to. It was during the probes, the infiltration, 0200, the darkest hour. A voice had come over the radio, faint, broken, a Marine from a position south of ours that had been overrun. He was alive, he was wounded, he was asking for help, giving his position, begging someone to come, and I'd heard him, clearly, every word. His position was 200 yards away, through ground we didn't hold, in darkness that was full of men trying to kill us. I could have relayed it, could have told Haskell, could have organized a rescue, a patrol, a movement through the dark toward a voice that was still breathing, but I didn't. I listened to the voice, and I calculated the cost, the men we'd lose trying to reach him, the positions we'd weaken, the risk to the pocket and the radio, and the 31 lives that depended on both, and I made the decision that the math demanded, and the soul couldn't afford. I turned the frequency, I changed the channel, and the voice disappeared, and I never heard it again. And I don't know if that Marine lived or died. I don't know his name. I don't know his face. I know only that he called for help, and I was the one who heard him. And I chose the many over the one because that was the calculus of Betio. That everything was a transaction, and every transaction had a cost. And the cost of saving one man might be losing the radio that kept 31 men connected to the only help that existed. I've told myself it was the right decision. I've told myself it 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, with 1,000 different justifications that all arrive at the same conclusion, that in war, the math makes choices that the heart can't live with, and living with them anyway is what they don't put on the recruiting posters. The tide came in, slowly, gently, the way tides do, indifferent to what lies beneath them, covering the reef and the shallows and the dark shapes that still rested on the coral. The water rose over the waiting corridor and erased it, turned it back into ocean, smooth and blue and empty as if nothing had ever crossed it, as if 500 yards of turquoise water had never been the longest distance on Earth. Harkin watched the tide with me. His face was still, not peaceful, not resolved, but still in the way that a surface is still when everything beneath it has sunk too deep to disturb it. "They'll send us somewhere else," he said. It wasn't a complaint. It wasn't resignation. It was a fact spoken by a man who understood that Betio was not the last island, and the Pacific was full of reefs, and the war had a geography that stretched far beyond this half-mile of coral. "I know," I said. "You'll carry the radio." "I know." He nodded. That was all. We didn't speak about what we'd seen or done or failed to do. We didn't process or reflect or find meaning, because meaning was a luxury that Betio had stripped from us along with everything else: sleep, safety, the belief that plans survive contact, the faith that courage is enough. What it left us was simpler and harder. It left us alive. Alive on an island of dead men, in a war that wasn't over, carrying the things we'd carry forever. The sounds, the choices, the faces, the frequency I'd turned away from in the dark. The tide kept coming in. The water covered the reef, covered the wreckage, covered the shapes that would be recovered and counted and added to a number that someone would print in a report. The lagoon smoothed itself out, blue and calm and indifferent, as if 76 hours of slaughter had been nothing more than weather, a storm that passed, leaving the ocean unchanged. The men didn't smooth out. We never would. The sun moved west. The shadows lengthened. And Betio sat in the Pacific like a wound the ocean couldn't close, holding its dead and its secrets in the silence that had replaced the guns. A silence that wasn't peace, wasn't victory, wasn't anything that had a name. It was just what was left when the shooting stopped and the math was done, and the tide came in like it always had, like it always would, long after the last man who remembered this place had joined the ones who never left it.